What happens to the weapon that ends one of history's most notorious lives? When Adolf Hitler took his final breath in a bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin on April 30th, 1945, he left behind more than a defeated empire and millions of shattered lives. He left behind a pistol, a Walther PPK 7.66mm, that would become one of the most sought-after and controversial artifacts of the 20th century. This was no ordinary firearm. This was the instrument of a dictator's final act, a relic that embodied the collapse of the Third Reich, and a symbol that nations, museums, and collectors would fight over for decades. The story of Hitler's death pistol is not merely about a gun. It is about the desperate scramble in the final days of World War II, about soldiers stumbling through smoke and rubble to claim pieces of history, about secrets kept and truths obscured, and about the uncomfortable reality that objects of evil hold a magnetic power over the human imagination. The pistol vanished almost immediately after Hitler's death, beginning a mystery that would perplex historians, investigators, and the public for generations. Where did it go? Who took it? And why does it matter so profoundly that this single weapon disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing world? The gun that Hitler allegedly used to end his life became an instant relic the moment Soviet and Allied forces converged on Berlin in those final apocalyptic days of April 1945. But unlike other artifacts of the Nazi regime, uniforms, medals, documents, this pistol carried a unique burden. It was the physical link to the moment when the architect of genocide chose death over capture, when the man who had plunged Europe into unprecedented darkness pulled a trigger one last time. The world was stunned not just by Hitler's death, but by the immediate mystery surrounding the weapon itself. How could something so significant simply vanish? Consider the magnitude of what this object represented. In the hands of Adolf Hitler, this pistol was not merely a tool of self-destruction. It was the final punctuation mark on a regime that had murdered 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, that had initiated a war costing over 70 million lives worldwide, that had reduced much of Europe to rubble and ash. The pistol was the instrument by which Hitler avoided capture, avoided trial, avoided the gallows that awaited other Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. It was the mechanism by which he exercised one final act of control over a life that had been devoted to controlling others. And then it disappeared, as if history itself had swallowed it whole. The disappearance began within hours, perhaps within minutes, of Hitler's death. In the chaotic final days of the Battle of Berlin, as Soviet forces fought street by street toward the city center, as desperate German soldiers and civilians fled or fought or hid, the Führerbunker became the eye of a historical hurricane. When Hitler's body was carried up to the Chancellery Garden and burned, witnesses scattered. Some fled westward, hoping to reach American or British lines. Others were captured by Soviet forces. The bunker itself became a treasure trove for Soviet intelligence officers who methodically catalogued and confiscated everything they could find. But in that methodical confiscation, something went wrong. The pistol that should have been the crown jewel of evidence, the weapon that ended Hitler's life, somehow slipped through the cracks of history. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20th, 1889, in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the border with Germany. His early life was marked by failure and frustration. He dreamed of becoming an artist but was rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He drifted through Vienna as a homeless vagrant, selling postcards and doing odd jobs, sleeping in flophouses, absorbing the virulent anti-Semitism that permeated certain segments of Viennese society. When World War I erupted in 1914, Hitler volunteered for the German army and found his calling. He served as a dispatch runner on the Western Front, was wounded twice, received the Iron Cross for bravery, and experienced the camaraderie and purpose that had eluded him in civilian life. Germany's defeat in 1918 devastated Hitler. He could not accept that Germany had been beaten militarily and instead embraced the stab-in-the-back legend, the false claim that Germany had been betrayed by Jews, communists, and weak politicians on the home front. This conspiracy theory became the foundation of Hitler's political worldview. He joined the German Workers' Party in 1919, quickly became its dominant figure, and transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. His oratorical skills, his ability to tap into German resentment and humiliation, and his ruthless elimination of rivals propelled him to national prominence. By 1933, Hitler had maneuvered himself into the position of Chancellor of Germany. Within months, he had consolidated dictatorial power, crushing opposition parties, silencing dissent, and establishing a totalitarian state. Over the next 6 years, Hitler rearmed Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, annexed Austria and the Sudetenland, and prepared for the war of conquest he had always envisioned. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, triggering World War II. Over the next 6 years, Hitler's armies would conquer most of Europe, from the Atlantic coast of France to the gates of Moscow, from Norway to North Africa. But conquest brought overextension. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Operation Barbarossa, was the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German soldiers. Initially successful, the invasion stalled in the brutal Russian winter. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked the turning point of the war in the East. Meanwhile, British resistance had thwarted Hitler's plans to invade England, and the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 added overwhelming industrial and military power to the Allied cause. By 1944, Germany was fighting a losing war on multiple fronts. The Holocaust, Hitler's systematic attempt to murder every Jew in Europe, proceeded even as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The death camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno and Majdanek operated at industrial efficiency, murdering thousands daily. Mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen massacred Jews in occupied Soviet territories. Hitler had made clear in his speeches and writings that the destruction of European Jewry was his central goal, and even as Germany lost the war, the machinery of genocide continued operating until Allied forces physically liberated the camps. By April 1945, the Reich that Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years was crumbling after just 12 years. Soviet forces had pushed westward from Stalingrad, liberating Eastern Europe and driving into Germany itself. American, British and Canadian forces had landed in Normandy in June 1944, liberated France, crossed the Rhine, and were now pushing toward Berlin from the west. Italy had already fallen. Hitler's allies had abandoned him. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of fuel. German cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing. Millions of German soldiers were dead, wounded or captured. The Holocaust had been exposed to the world as Allied forces liberated the death camps and revealed the full scope of Nazi atrocities. Hitler had moved permanently into the Führer bunker in January 1945 as Allied bombing made the Reich Chancellery uninhabitable. The bunker complex was located beneath the Chancellery Garden, accessed by a series of staircases that descended 30 feet underground. The complex consisted of 2 levels: the upper Vorbunker, which housed staff quarters, kitchen and storage, and the lower Führerbunker proper, where Hitler maintained his personal quarters, conference room, and the small suite where he would spend his final hours. The bunker was a claustrophobic nightmare. 18 small rooms divided by concrete corridors barely 6 feet wide, ceilings so low that tall men had to stoop, ventilation that barely functioned, leaving the air stale and fetid. The walls constantly sweated with condensation. The hum of diesel generators provided background noise, occasionally drowned out by the thunder of Soviet artillery, which grew steadily closer day by day. By late April, the bunker housed approximately 40 people: Hitler's personal staff, military officers, secretaries, doctors, guards, and Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, who had insisted on joining him for his final stand. Hitler's physical deterioration in these final weeks was profound and shocking to those who had known him in earlier years. Once a dynamic speaker whose charisma had captivated millions, he had become a shuffling, trembling wreck. His left hand shook uncontrollably, possibly from Parkinson's disease, possibly from the cocktail of drugs his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, had been injecting into him for years. He dragged his left leg when he walked. His face was pale and puffy. His eyes, once described as mesmerizing and intense, were now bloodshot and dull. He suffered from insomnia, often sleeping only a few hours before waking to study maps and issue orders to armies that no longer existed. The deterioration was not merely physical, but mental. Hitler spent hours moving imaginary divisions around maps of Berlin, ordering counterattacks that could never materialize, living in a fantasy world where Germany might still achieve victory. When subordinates tried to inject reality into these discussions, Hitler flew into rages, accusing them of defeatism and treachery. Several officers who had served him for years later described the surreal quality of those final days, watching a man who had once commanded the most powerful military machine in Europe reduced to shuffling papers in a concrete tomb while the Reich collapsed around him. The choice that Hitler made on April 30th, 1945 was perhaps the only honest assessment of reality he had made in years. Soviet forces were less than 1,000 feet from the bunker. Russian voices could be heard above ground. Artillery shells were landing in the Chancellery Garden. There was no hope of escape, no prospect of rescue, no military miracle that could save him. Hitler had several options. He could attempt to flee Berlin, though any escape would likely end in capture. He could surrender to Soviet forces, though he knew what fate awaited him. Stalin would parade him through Moscow before a show trial and execution. He could wait to be captured and hope for better treatment from American or British forces. Or he could take his own life on his own terms. Hitler chose death, but the manner of that death would become one of the most debated and controversial aspects of his story. The pistol, the Walther PPK, 7.65mm that Hitler kept in his possession, would be central to resolving exactly how Hitler died and what happened in those final moments. But to understand why the pistol's disappearance became such a profound mystery, one must first understand what a Walther PPK was and why Hitler chose this particular weapon as his instrument of suicide. The Walther PPK was not a dramatic or imposing weapon. Standing for Polizeipistole Kriminalmodell, Police Pistol Detective Model, it was a compact, lightweight, semi-automatic handgun designed in 1931 by the German arms manufacturer Karl Walter GmbH Sportwaffen. The PPK was a scaled-down version of the earlier Walther PP Polizeipistole, designed to be easily concealed and carried by plainclothes police officers and detectives. Chambered in 7.65mm, 32 ACP, it was not a particularly powerful weapon, effective at close range but lacking the stopping power of larger caliber pistols. The PPK became popular with German police forces, military officers, and Nazi officials precisely because of its concealability and reliability. It was well crafted, accurate within its effective range, and comfortable to carry. Hitler owned several firearms throughout his time in power, but the Walther PPK became his personal sidearm of choice. According to accounts from his bodyguards and staff, Hitler kept a PPK in his possession at all times from the mid-1930s onward. The weapon represented not just self-defense, but a final option. Hitler had long stated that he would never allow himself to be captured alive. To understand why Hitler's death pistol became such a powerful and sought-after object, one must understand the culture of trophy-taking that defined the final days of World War II. As Allied and Soviet forces pushed into Germany from both east and west, soldiers became collectors of history. They took Nazi flags, medals, uniforms, weapons, documents, anything that might serve as proof of where they had been and what they had witnessed. Some took these items as souvenirs, mementos of their service and survival. Others saw them as war trophies, symbols of victory over an evil regime. Still others recognized their potential value, both historical and monetary. The practice was so widespread that military authorities on all sides attempted to regulate it with varying degrees of success. The U.S. Army technically prohibited soldiers from taking enemy equipment as souvenirs, but enforcement was lax, and officers often looked the other way. Soviet forces operated under different rules. Stalin had specifically ordered that valuable intelligence materials and historically significant items be secured and sent to Moscow, but individual soldiers also took personal souvenirs. British forces fell somewhere in between, with official policies against looting but practical acknowledgement that soldiers would take mementos. The trophy-taking culture created a massive grey market in Nazi artifacts that began even before the war ended and has continued to the present day. Items with direct connections to Hitler himself were exponentially more valuable than ordinary Nazi memorabilia. Hitler's personal effects, his uniforms, his artwork, his furniture, his books, became some of the most sought-after items. But nothing would be more valuable or controversial than the weapon he used to end his life. The Soviets, who reached Berlin first and captured the bunker, were particularly systematic in their collection efforts. Stalin had given explicit orders that any evidence related to Hitler's death be secured and brought back to Moscow. This was partly for intelligence purposes. Stalin wanted absolute certainty that Hitler was dead and had not somehow escaped to continue the war from some hidden redoubt. But it was also for propaganda. Stalin wanted to control the narrative of Hitler's end, to present the Soviet Union as the force that had defeated Nazi Germany, and ended the greatest evil the world had ever known. The circumstances of Hitler's death were witnessed by only a handful of people, and their accounts varied in crucial details that would later fuel decades of controversy and conspiracy theories. According to the most widely accepted version, assembled from testimonies of bunker survivors and corroborated by physical evidence, Hitler spent the afternoon of April 29, 1945, dictating his political testament and his personal will to one of his secretaries. In these final documents, Hitler blamed the Jews for starting the war, expelled Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler from the Nazi Party for attempting to negotiate with the Allies, appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and urged the German people to continue fighting. That same afternoon, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony conducted by a minor city official who had been brought to the bunker for that purpose. It was a strange, surreal event, a wedding celebrated in a concrete tomb while Soviet shells exploded overhead, with champagne drunk from crystal glasses by people who knew they might be dead within hours. After the ceremony, Hitler and Braun joined their small circle of remaining staff for what would be their final social gathering, a grim parody of a wedding reception with forced conversation and hollow toasts to a future that would never come. Hitler said his farewells to his remaining staff on the morning of April 30th. According to witnesses, he moved through the bunker shaking hands, thanking people for their service, speaking in a detached, mechanical manner. Some of those present later described being disturbed by Hitler's calmness. He showed no emotion, no regret, no fear. He simply went through the motions as if following a script he had written long before. He gave specific instructions about what was to be done with his body after death. He was to be shot if the suicide attempt somehow failed. His body and Eva Braun's body were to be burned completely, leaving nothing for the Soviets to capture and display. Around 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, Hitler and Braun retired to Hitler's private study, a small room furnished with a desk, a sofa, and 2 chairs. They closed the door. Those waiting outside, Hitler's valet Heinz Linger, his SS adjutant Otto Günsche, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels, and several others, stood in the corridor, waiting for what they knew was coming. The minutes stretched. No sound came from behind the closed door. Then, around 3:30 p.m., those waiting heard a single gunshot, muffled but unmistakable. Linger and Günsche waited several minutes before opening the door, following Hitler's instructions that they give him time to ensure death was complete. When they finally entered, they found a scene that would be described and analyzed countless times over the following decades. Hitler was slumped on the sofa, his head tilted slightly to the right. Blood dripped from his right temple and had pooled on the sofa and carpet. A Walther PPK 7.65-meter pistol lay near his right hand. Eva Braun was beside him, also dead, her body showing no signs of violence. The smell of bitter almonds, the telltale scent of cyanide, filled the room. On the table in front of the sofa lay a crushed cyanide capsule. But even this seemingly clear scene has been challenged and complicated by alternative testimonies and forensic questions that persist to this day. Some witnesses claimed that Hitler bit down on a cyanide capsule and then shot himself as a redundancy, ensuring death even if the poison somehow failed. This would explain both the gunshot wound and the smell of cyanide. Others suggested that Hitler only took poison and that the gunshot wound was either self-inflicted in a final moment of consciousness or was staged afterward by aides who wanted Hitler to have died in a more soldier-like manner than by poison. The Soviet autopsy, conducted in secret immediately after the bodies were discovered by Red Army soldiers on May 2nd, allegedly found cyanide in Hitler's system, but also noted the gunshot wound to the head. However, this autopsy was never made fully public until decades later, and even when portions were released, questions remained about the body's identification. The conflicting evidence created immediate uncertainty about the exact manner of Hitler's death, and the pistol became absolutely central to resolving this question. If Hitler shot himself, the pistol would show evidence of having been recently fired. If the wound was staged, the weapon might have been fired at a different time or might not match the wound. Ballistic and forensic testing could potentially answer these questions, but only if the pistol could be located and examined. The formation of the pistol's legend began within hours of Hitler's death. According to standing orders that Hitler himself had given, his and Braun's bodies were to be burned to prevent them from being captured and displayed by the Soviets. The example of Benito Mussolini haunted Hitler's final days. Just 5 days earlier, on April 25th, Italian partisans had captured and executed Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, as they attempted to flee to Switzerland. The bodies had been taken to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a gas station, where crowds gathered to spit on them, kick them, and abuse them. Photographs of the dangling corpses had been published worldwide. Hitler was determined to avoid this fate. Following orders, Linge and Günsche carried Hitler's body up the 4 flights of stairs from the bunker to the Chancellery Garden. Other aides carried Braun's body. The garden was being shelled sporadically by Soviet artillery, and those carrying the bodies had to move quickly between explosions. The bodies were placed in a shell crater, about 3 meters from the bunker emergency exit. Günsche poured gasoline from jerry cans over both bodies, then stood back, while Linge tossed a burning rag onto the gasoline. The bodies ignited immediately, flames leaping several feet into the air. The cremation was observed by several bunker inhabitants who had ventured outside despite the danger. They stood at the bunker entrance, raised their arms in Nazi salutes, and watched the Führer burn. But the cremation was far from complete. The amount of gasoline available was limited. The fire burned for about 2 hours, but this was insufficient to completely incinerate 2 adult bodies. When Soviet soldiers discovered the remains 2 days later, they found charred but partially intact corpses that could still be autopsied and identified through dental records. Meanwhile, back in the bunker, the pistol disappeared. Soviet troops first entered the bunker on May 2nd, encountering scattered German soldiers and civilians who had taken refuge there. The Soviets conducted a thorough search, confiscating documents, personal effects, and anything that might be historically or strategically significant. But accounts of what happened to Hitler's pistol are contradictory, incomplete, and frustratingly vague. Some reports suggest that Soviet intelligence officers, specifically members of Smersh, Stalin's military counterintelligence agency, secured the pistol immediately upon entering Hitler's study and sent it to Moscow along with other key evidence. This would make sense. Soviet authorities would certainly have wanted the weapon for both investigative and propaganda purposes. However, no Soviet documentation has ever been released confirming the pistol's transport to Moscow or its subsequent storage in Soviet archives. Other accounts claim that German officers in the bunker removed the weapon before Soviet forces arrived. This seems less likely given the timeline. Hitler died on April 30th, and Soviet forces were fighting in the immediate vicinity of the Chancellery. Any German attempting to leave the bunker area would have had to navigate through Soviet positions, and most of those who tried were either killed or captured. But in the chaos of battle, it is conceivable that someone could have pocketed the pistol and successfully escaped westward. Still, other suggestions have been made over the years that the pistol was taken by one of Hitler's aides during the confusion and chaos following his death, perhaps hidden or destroyed, according to instructions Hitler had given before his suicide. Some historians have speculated that the weapon was deliberately destroyed by German loyalists who feared that its preservation would allow the Allies to create a grotesque museum exhibit centered on Hitler's death. The most frustrating aspect of these conflicting stories is that they cannot all be true, yet each has its adherents and its circumstantial evidence. The absence of definitive documentation, a receipt, a transport order, a photograph, a witness statement that can be corroborated, means that the pistol's fate remains genuinely uncertain more than 7 decades after Hitler's death. The central question surrounding Hitler's death pistol transcends simple curiosity about the location of a historical artifact. It touches on profound themes about the nature of evil, the materiality of history, the ethics of remembrance, and the uncomfortable human fascination with objects associated with darkness and death. Why does this particular weapon hold such power over the historical imagination? Why have museums, collectors, governments, and researchers expended significant resources over decades trying to locate, authenticate, or debunk various pistols that have been claimed as the weapon Hitler used to end his life? The answer lies in the uncomfortable and complex relationship between evil and materiality, the way that objects associated with historical atrocities carry a dark magnetism that both repels and attracts. Hitler's pistol, if authentic, would be a direct physical link to the moment when Nazi Germany's leader acknowledged ultimate defeat by destroying himself. It would be the object that ended World War II in Europe, at least symbolically. It would be the instrument that prevented Hitler from facing justice at Nuremberg, from being forced to answer for the Holocaust in a public court, from being humiliated and executed before the watching world. This symbolic weight explains why multiple pistols have been presented over the years as Hitler's death gun, and why each claim has been met with intense scrutiny, passionate debate, and inevitable skepticism. The authentication of such an object is extraordinarily difficult for multiple reasons. The chaos of the bunker's final hours destroyed normal chains of custody. The deaths of many witnesses eliminated first-hand testimony that might have been definitive. The Soviet Union's decades-long secrecy about what they found in the bunker prevented proper documentation and verification. And the enormous financial value of an authenticated Hitler artifact creates powerful incentives for forgery, fraud, and wishful thinking. One of the most famous and ultimately discredited claims came from the Soviet archives themselves. For decades, Soviet authorities maintained that they had recovered Hitler's body, or rather fragments of his skull and jawbone, from the Chancellery Garden where it had been partially burned. These remains, kept in secret Soviet archives, supposedly proved definitively how Hitler had died. A portion of skull with a bullet hole was presented as evidence that Hitler had shot himself. Soviet forensic experts claimed that dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Hitler, and that the bullet trajectory was consistent with suicide. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian authorities became more open about what they possessed. They displayed what they claimed was part of Hitler's skull, complete with a bullet hole, at exhibitions in Moscow. The skull fragment became one of the most photographed and discussed pieces of evidence related to Hitler's death. For many, it seemed to settle the question once and for all. Hitler had shot himself, and here was the physical proof. However, in 2009, American archaeologist and bone specialist Nick Bellantoni was granted permission to examine the skull fragment and extract DNA samples for testing. The results were shocking. DNA analysis revealed that the skull fragment actually belonged to a woman, probably between 20 and 40 years old, definitely not Adolf Hitler. This revelation undermined decades of Soviet claims about what they had found in the bunker and cast doubt on other Soviet assertions about recovered artifacts, including any claims they might have made about possessing Hitler's pistol. The skull fragment debacle illustrates a larger problem with authenticating Hitler artifacts. Physical evidence can be misidentified, either through honest error or deliberate fraud. In the chaotic aftermath of Berlin's fall, with bodies burned, buried, exhumed, and reburied multiple times, with Soviet soldiers collecting anything that might be valuable or historically significant, mistakes were inevitable. The woman whose skull fragment was mistaken for Hitler's was likely one of the many people who died in and around the bunker during those final days. Perhaps Eva Braun, though later analysis suggested it wasn't her either. Perhaps a secretary or female staff member. Perhaps a civilian who had taken refuge in the bunker complex. The pistol's disappearance also raises profound questions about memory, evidence, and historical truth. In an age before universal DNA testing, video documentation, and digital forensics, proving what happened in a bunker beneath a burning city depended entirely on human testimony and physical evidence. But humans lie, misremember, embellish, and distort. Physical evidence can be manipulated, misidentified, lost, or destroyed. The pistol's absence created a vacuum that speculation, mythology, and competing narratives rushed to fill. Consider the nature of the witnesses whose testimonies form the basis of what we think we know about Hitler's final moments. Most were fanatically loyal Nazis who had every reason to shape the story in ways that served their interests. Some wanted to portray Hitler's death as noble and soldier-like, a brave leader choosing death over surrender. Others wanted to distance themselves from Hitler's regime, to claim they were merely following orders, to present themselves as unwilling participants in atrocities. Their testimonies, given under Soviet interrogation or later to Western investigators, must be evaluated critically, recognizing the biases and motivations that shaped them. Heinz Linger, Hitler's valet, gave multiple accounts of what he found in Hitler's study. In some versions, Hitler had shot himself in the right temple. In others, the wound was to the mouth. Linger's accounts also varied regarding whether he smelled gunpowder or cyanide more strongly, and whether the pistol was in Hitler's hand or on the floor beside him. Were these inconsistencies the result of trauma and confusion, or were they deliberate obfuscations? Linger spent years in Soviet captivity before being released in 1955. How much did Soviet interrogators influence his story? Otto Günsche, Hitler's SS adjutant, gave testimony that generally corroborated Linger's account, but with its own variations and contradictions. Günsche claimed he entered the study immediately after Linger and saw Hitler's body still seated on the sofa with blood flowing from a wound. But other witnesses claimed that Günsche waited longer before entering, and that by the time he saw the body, it had already been moved. These discrepancies matter because they affect our understanding of the scene, and by extension, the role and location of the pistol. The question of what exactly killed Hitler, cyanide, gunshot, or both, has never been definitively resolved, and the missing pistol is central to that unresolved question. If Hitler bit a cyanide capsule and died from the poison, the gunshot wound might have been self-inflicted in a final moment of consciousness as the poison began to work, or it might have been inflicted by an aide after death to create the appearance of a more martial end. If Hitler shot himself and died instantly from the gunshot, the smell of cyanide might have come from a capsule he had bitten but which had not yet taken full effect, or from Eva Braun's use of cyanide beside him. The Soviet autopsy, conducted secretly on May 8, 1945, by a forensic team led by Dr. Faust Shkaravsky, reported finding glass splinters in Hitler's mouth, consistent with biting a cyanide capsule. The autopsy also documented the gunshot wound, but noted that the skull was badly damaged, making precise determination of the bullet's trajectory difficult. The autopsy concluded that Hitler had died from cyanide poisoning, with the gunshot being either simultaneous or occurring just before death. However, this report was classified by Stalin and not released to the West until decades later, and even then only in partial form. The full autopsy report, with all its photographs and detailed findings, has never been completely released to the public. Stalin's decision to classify the autopsy and other evidence about Hitler's death had far-reaching consequences for historical understanding. Without access to Soviet findings, Western historians were forced to rely on witness testimony alone. This created space for conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Theories claiming that Hitler escaped from Berlin, that the body found was a double, that the whole suicide story was a cover-up. While serious historians have thoroughly debunked these theories, they retain surprising staying power in popular culture, fueled partly by the Soviet secrecy that prevented definitive proof of Hitler's death from being publicly established for decades. Another central theme is the macabre but undeniable market for Nazi memorabilia. In the decades after World War II, a thriving international trade in Nazi artifacts developed, driven by a complex mix of motivations. Some collectors are serious historians who view these objects as important primary sources that should be preserved for educational purposes. Some are military history enthusiasts, fascinated by the weapons, uniforms, and equipment of the era. Some are investors who recognize that Nazi memorabilia, however distasteful, has significant monetary value, and some, disturbingly, are neo-Nazi sympathizers who venerate Hitler and the Third Reich, seeking these objects as icons to worship. Uniforms, medals, flags, and weapons associated with the Third Reich command, high prices at auctions and in private sales. A standard SS uniform might sell for thousands of dollars. A Knight's Cross medal might fetch tens of thousands. Items with direct connections to Hitler himself are exponentially more valuable. Hitler's paintings, when they occasionally come to market, have sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars. His personal effects, pieces of furniture, books from his library, even fragments of documents with his signature, are avidly sought by collectors. In this context, Hitler's death pistol, if it could be authenticated and made available for sale, would be worth a fortune. Estimates have ranged from several $100,000 to several million, depending on the buyer and the circumstances of sale. This commercial reality has created powerful incentives for forgery and fraud. If someone could convincingly claim to possess Hitler's death pistol, authenticated and provable through documentation and forensic analysis, they would possess one of the most valuable artifacts of the 20th century. This uncomfortable truth, that objects of evil have monetary value, complicates the ethical questions surrounding such artifacts profoundly. Should Hitler's pistol, if found and authenticated, be displayed in a museum? Would such display serve an educational purpose, helping people understand the reality of Hitler's end and the collapse of the Nazi regime? Or would it create a macabre focal point that draws attention away from the millions of victims and toward the perpetrator? Would it become a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis, a place where extremists might gather to venerate the memory of history's greatest monster? Museums worldwide have grappled with these questions in their decisions about how to present Nazi-era artifacts. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. displays artifacts from concentration camps, including personal belongings of victims, tools used in the murder process, and documentation of the Nazi bureaucracy of death. The museum's approach is carefully designed to honor victims and educate visitors about the Holocaust without glorifying the perpetrators. Objects belonging to Nazi leaders are displayed sparingly and always in contexts that emphasize the horror they caused rather than any power or prestige they might have possessed. The German Historical Museum in Berlin faces similar challenges in presenting the Nazi era as part of German history. German law strictly prohibits the display of Nazi symbols and memorabilia except in educational or historical contexts, and museums must demonstrate that their presentations serve legitimate educational purposes rather than glorifying the regime. This legal framework reflects Germany's ongoing struggle with its Nazi past and its determination to prevent any resurgence of Nazi ideology. But what would such a museum do with Hitler's pistol? The weapon's significance is undeniable. It is directly connected to one of the most important moments of the 20th century, yet displaying it raises uncomfortable questions. Would a museum case containing the pistol become the most visited exhibit, drawing crowds eager to see the gun that killed Hitler? Would photographs of the pistol circulate online, becoming fodder for memes, jokes, or worse, neo-Nazi propaganda? These are not hypothetical concerns. Museums have learned through experience that controversial artifacts can generate reactions far beyond what curators intend. The pistol also embodies questions about the banality of evil, a concept famously explored by political theorist Hannah Arendt in her coverage of the Adolf Eichmann trial in 1961. Eichmann, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust, had been captured by Israeli intelligence in Argentina and brought to Jerusalem to stand trial for crimes against humanity. Arendt, covering the trial for the New Yorker magazine, was struck by how ordinary Eichmann appeared. She expected a demonic monster, but found instead a bureaucratic functionary who claimed to have simply been following orders, doing his job, advancing his career. Arendt's controversial conclusion was that great evil often results not from sadistic monsters, but from ordinary people committing atrocities within systems that normalize cruelty. She coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe this phenomenon. Eichmann was not a psychopath driven by bloodlust. He was a mediocre man seeking advancement who enthusiastically participated in genocide because the system in which he operated rewarded such participation. Hitler's pistol embodies this banality in a strange way. The weapon itself is utterly ordinary, a mass-produced German firearm, simple and functional. Thousands of identical Walther PPKs were manufactured. There is nothing inherently evil about the metal and mechanics of the weapon. A Walther PPK sitting on a table is just a gun, indistinguishable from thousands of others. Its significance exists entirely in what it represents and who used it. This ordinariness is both disturbing and instructive. Evil does not require special tools or supernatural elements. It requires only human choices and human actions. The market for Nazi memorabilia forces another uncomfortable reflection on human nature. Why do these objects command such high prices? Why are collectors willing to pay fortunes for items associated with a regime that murdered millions? The answers vary depending on the collector, but several patterns emerge. Some collectors are driven by historical interest. They want to own pieces of history, to preserve them, to study them. These collectors often donate their items to museums or make them available to researchers. They see themselves as custodians of history rather than profiteers. Other collectors are driven by investment considerations. Nazi memorabilia has proven to be a surprisingly stable investment over the decades. Items that sold for modest sums in the 1950s now command prices orders of magnitude higher. Collectors who purchased Nazi artifacts decades ago have seen enormous returns on their investments. This financial dimension attracts people who might have no personal interest in Nazi history, but recognize a lucrative market. More disturbingly, Some collectors are motivated by ideological sympathy with Nazism. Neo-Nazi movements exist in many countries, despite legal prohibitions in places like Germany and Austria. These extremists venerate Hitler and seek objects associated with him and his regime. For them, owning Hitler's pistol would not be about historical preservation or investment. It would be about possessing a sacred relic, a physical connection to the leader they worship. The thought that Hitler's pistol might end up in such hands is deeply troubling to historians, Jewish groups, and anyone concerned about the resurgence of fascist ideologies. Some countries have attempted to address these concerns through legislation. Germany and Austria strictly regulate the sale and display of Nazi artifacts. France has laws against the sale of certain Nazi items. Israel prohibits the import of Nazi memorabilia except for educational or research purposes. But in countries with more permissive laws, including the United States and United Kingdom, the trade continues largely unregulated. Online auction sites periodically face controversies over Nazi items being sold on their platforms, leading to policy changes that ban some categories of items while allowing others. The ethical dilemma extends beyond the commercial market to questions of what should be done with Hitler's pistol if it were found. Should it be destroyed to prevent it from becoming a shrine for extremists? This would eliminate any risk of the weapon being venerated, but it would also destroy a significant historical artifact. Should it be kept in a government archive, never displayed, available only to serious researchers with proper credentials? This would preserve it while minimizing risk, but it would also deprive the public of access to an important piece of evidence about Hitler's end. Should it be displayed publicly in a museum with appropriate context and educational materials? This would maximize its educational value, but also risk creating exactly the kind of macabre focal point that could attract the wrong kind of attention. Over the decades since Hitler's death, various proposals and solutions have been offered to resolve the mystery of the missing pistol. These have ranged from investigative journalism to scientific analysis, to governmental transparency initiatives, to private detective work. Each approach has revealed pieces of the puzzle, though none has definitively solved it, and each has contributed to our understanding of what happened in those chaotic final days in Berlin. The first major attempt to establish what happened in the bunker came from Hugh Trevor Roper, a British intelligence officer and historian who was tasked in September 1945 with investigating the circumstances of Hitler's death. Trevor Roper's assignment came from British intelligence chiefs who were concerned about rumors that Hitler had escaped from Berlin. Stalin himself was publicly expressing doubt about whether Hitler was really dead, and the lack of definitive proof was creating uncertainty among Allied leaders. The British wanted their own independent investigation to establish the facts. Trevor Roper spent several months tracking down and interviewing witnesses, examining available evidence, and piecing together the narrative of Hitler's final days. He interviewed Heinz Linger, Otto Günscher, Hitler's secretaries Gertrud Junge and Else Krüger, Hitler's pilot Hans Bauer, and numerous other bunker inhabitants who had survived and been captured by British or American forces. He examined documents, photographs, and physical evidence. His investigation was remarkably thorough given the circumstances. Germany was in ruins, witnesses were scattered across occupation zones, and Soviet authorities refused to cooperate or share their evidence. Trevor Roper published his findings in 1947 in The Last Days of Hitler, a book that became the standard account of Hitler's death and remained influential for decades. His conclusion was that Hitler had died by his own hand on April 30th, 1945, most likely by shooting himself, while simultaneously or immediately after biting a cyanide capsule. Regarding the pistol, Trevor Roper concluded that it was likely a Walther PPK 7.65 mm, Hitler's preferred personal weapon, based on witness descriptions. But Trevor Roper could not determine what happened to the weapon after Hitler's death. None of his interviewees claimed to have taken it, and no documentary evidence existed to trace its movements. Trevor Roper's work was groundbreaking and established the basic narrative that most historians still accept today. However, his investigation was also limited by significant factors. He had no access to Soviet evidence, since Stalin had classified all materials related to Hitler's death and refused to share them with Western allies. He had to rely entirely on witness testimony, which was sometimes contradictory and always subject to the limitations of memory and the biases of the witnesses. He had no physical evidence to examine, no body, no pistol, no forensic data. His conclusions were the best possible given the circumstances, but they remained necessarily incomplete. The Soviet version of events remained locked away in classified archives for decades, creating a gap in historical knowledge that frustrated Western researchers. The Soviets had conducted their own extensive investigation of Hitler's death, led by Smersh counterintelligence units. They had discovered the partially burned bodies in the Chancellery Garden on May 2, 1945, and conducted autopsies on May 8. They had interrogated captured bunker personnel, including Hitler's personal adjutant Otto Günsche and his valet Heinz Linger, who spent years in Soviet captivity. They had collected extensive documentation, photographs, and physical evidence from the bunker. But Stalin ordered all of this material classified at the highest level. Stalin's motivations were complex. He genuinely worried that Hitler might have escaped. The burned bodies were badly damaged, and identification was challenging. He wanted Soviet investigators to be absolutely certain before announcing Hitler's death. But Stalin also saw propaganda value in maintaining uncertainty. By publicly expressing doubt about whether Hitler was dead, Stalin could suggest that Western allies were harboring Hitler, or that the whole suicide story was a Western fabrication. This served Stalin's political interests in the emerging Cold War. The Soviet archives began to open in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russian authorities, motivated partly by new openness and partly by desire for hard currency, began allowing Western researchers access to previously classified materials. The revelations were stunning and reshaped historical understanding of Hitler's final days. Autopsy reports were released showing that Soviet forensic teams had found cyanide in Hitler's system and had documented the gunshot wound. Photographs emerged showing Soviet soldiers in the bunker examining Hitler's personal effects. Interrogation transcripts revealed what captured bunker personnel had told their Soviet captors immediately after the events. Regarding weapons recovered from the bunker, Soviet records indicated that multiple firearms had been collected by intelligence officers in their systematic search of the complex. These included several Walther PPK pistols, as well as other handguns and rifles. This revelation significantly complicated the question of which specific pistol Hitler had used. If multiple similar weapons were present in the bunker, identification would require knowing the exact serial number of Hitler's personal weapon or having testimony from an eyewitness who could identify the specific gun. Such definitive evidence has never emerged publicly. The opening of Soviet archives also revealed the bizarre fate of Hitler's remains. After the initial autopsy in May 1945, the charred bodies were buried near the bunker. But as Soviet forces prepared to hand over their occupation zone to other Allied powers, Smersh units exhumed the remains and moved them to another location. Over the following years, the remains were moved multiple times, buried and exhumed again and again as political circumstances changed. Finally, in 1970, the KGB, successor to Smersh, decided to completely destroy what remained of Hitler's body. The bones were crushed, burned, and the ashes scattered in a river. The motivation was to prevent Hitler's grave from becoming a shrine for neo-Nazis. This destruction of evidence, while understandable from a political perspective, created enormous problems for historical verification. Without Hitler's remains available for modern forensic analysis, many questions about his death could never be definitively answered. The skull fragment that Russians claimed was Hitler's, the one later proven through DNA testing to belong to a woman, was apparently not from the body that was destroyed in 1970, but from other remains found in or near the bunker. This suggests that Soviet authorities themselves were uncertain about which remains were Hitler's, or that they had multiple sets of remains that they believed might be his. In 2018, an American auction house based in Maryland created international controversy when it announced plans to sell a Walther PPK that the seller claimed was Hitler's suicide weapon. The pistol had supposedly been taken from the bunker by a member of the American military, who had somehow obtained it from Soviet forces or from German personnel fleeing Berlin. The auction house, Alexander Historical Auctions, set an estimated price range of $100,000 to $250,000 for the weapon and promoted it heavily in advance of the planned sale. The announcement triggered immediate and intense backlash from Jewish groups, Holocaust survivors, historians, and the public. The Rabbinical Assembly, representing conservative rabbis worldwide, issued a statement condemning the sale as abhorrent and deeply offensive. The American Jewish Committee called it disgusting and urged the auction house to withdraw the pistol. Holocaust survivors who were interviewed by media expressed horror that someone would profit from selling the weapon Hitler used to escape justice for his crimes. Historians questioned the pistol's authenticity. The documentation provided by the seller was vague and unverifiable. The claimed chain of custody had gaps and contradictions. There was no serial number matching to Hitler's known personal weapon. There was no forensic evidence linking it to the bunker or to Hitler's death. Most serious historians concluded that the pistol was almost certainly not authentic, that it was either a fraud or at best a case of mistaken identity, where someone had misidentified an ordinary Walther PPK as Hitler's death weapon. Beyond questions of authenticity, the controversy raised fundamental ethical issues about whether such an item should be sold at all, even if it were authentic. Critics argued that selling Hitler's suicide weapon would be morally reprehensible. It would enrich those who traffic in Nazi memorabilia. It would create a marketable commodity from genocide. It would potentially place this significant historical artifact in the hands of someone who might venerate Hitler rather than study history objectively. The sale would treat Hitler's pistol as just another collectible, no different from a rare coin or vintage car, when in fact it was an object intimately connected to the murder of millions. Facing mounting pressure and negative publicity, Alexander Historical Auctions ultimately withdrew the pistol from sale in May 2018. The auction house issued a statement saying it had decided not to proceed with the sale after repeated consultation with a number of individuals and organizations concerned about the ethical implications. The statement emphasized that the auction house had never intended to glorify Hitler or Nazism, that their goal was historical preservation, but that they recognized the deep sensitivities surrounding such an object. The 2018 controversy highlighted the ongoing challenges surrounding Hitler artifacts. Even decades after World War II, objects associated with Hitler retain their dark power to provoke strong reactions. The incident also demonstrated that there is no consensus on how to handle such items ethically. Some argued the pistol should have been donated to a museum where it could be properly contextualized and used for education. Others insisted it should be destroyed to prevent it from ever becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Still others thought it should remain in private hands where at least its location would be known, rather than circulating on a black market where it might disappear into the hands of extremists. Authentication remains the central challenge for any claimed Hitler artifact, and modern forensic science offers tools that were unavailable in 1945. DNA analysis could potentially identify biological material on the pistol, though after more than 70 years, such material would likely be degraded or contaminated. Metallurgical testing could determine when and where the pistol was manufactured, confirming whether it matches the type of weapon Hitler was known to carry. Ballistics examination could compare the weapon to any forensic evidence that might exist from the bunker, though such evidence would need to have been properly preserved in 1945. Documentary forensics could analyze any papers claiming to establish the pistol's provenance, checking paper composition, ink chemistry, and handwriting against known authentic documents. But these techniques all require access to the object in question and to comparative materials. If the real Hitler pistol is hidden in a private collection, it cannot be tested. If it was destroyed, either deliberately or accidentally, then authentication is impossible. The absence of a definitive chain of custody from April 30, 1945, to the present day means that any claimed Hitler pistol must be viewed with profound skepticism unless extraordinarily strong evidence can be provided. Some historians have proposed that the entire question is misdirected, that the obsession with the pistol distracts from more important historical questions. Does it really matter which specific gun Hitler used? Is the location of the weapon as significant as understanding how Hitler rose to power, why so many Germans followed him into catastrophe, how the Holocaust was organized and executed, what enabled ordinary people to commit extraordinary atrocities, and what lessons World War II holds for preventing future genocides? From this perspective, the pistol mystery is a footnote, a curiosity that appeals to collectors and sensationalists, but does not illuminate the fundamental historical questions. The important facts are established beyond reasonable doubt. Hitler died by his own hand on April 30, 1945, ending his reign of terror. Whether he used a Walther PPK or some other weapon, Whether the gun is now in Moscow or Maryland or at the bottom of a river does not change our understanding of Hitler's crimes or the collapse of the Third Reich. Yet even this dismissive view acknowledges the pistol's symbolic power. The fact that historians feel compelled to argue that the pistol does not matter proves that it does matter, at least in the popular and cultural imagination. The weapon has become symbolic of larger questions about evidence, memory, and historical truth. In an era of increasing skepticism about established narratives, when conspiracy theories flourish online and basic historical facts are disputed for political purposes, the missing pistol serves as a useful reminder that even seemingly simple questions, what happened to Hitler's gun, can be impossible to answer definitively. The disappearance of Hitler's death pistol raises profound ethical, philosophical, and practical questions that extend far beyond the object itself. At the heart of these questions is a fundamental tension that societies have struggled with since 1945. How should we remember and memorialize evil? What responsibility do we have to preserve evidence of atrocities, even when that preservation might inadvertently celebrate or enable those who admire such evil? How do we balance historical education against the risk of creating icons for extremists? Museums and memorial sites worldwide grapple with these questions daily in their decisions about what to preserve, what to display, and how to contextualize artifacts from dark periods of history. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. displays thousands of artifacts from concentration camps, including shoes, suitcases, and personal belongings of victims. The museum's approach is carefully designed through extensive consultation with Holocaust survivors, educators, and ethicists. The goal is to honor victims and educate visitors about the reality of the Holocaust without glorifying the perpetrators or reducing the genocide to an abstract historical event. Objects belonging to Nazi leaders are displayed sparingly at the Holocaust Museum and always in contexts that emphasize the horror they caused rather than any power or prestige they might have possessed. A Nazi uniform is not displayed as an impressive military garment, but as the clothing of men who carried out systematic murder. Documents signed by Nazi officials are presented not as important signatures, but as bureaucratic evidence of how genocide was organized and executed. This careful contextualization is essential to ensuring that artifacts serve educational purposes rather than becoming objects of morbid fascination. But what would such a museum do with Hitler's pistol? The weapon's historical significance is undeniable. It is directly connected to one of the most important moments of the 20th century, the death of the man who caused World War II and ordered the Holocaust. Yet displaying it raises uncomfortable questions that have no easy answers. Would a museum case containing the pistol become the most visited exhibit, drawing crowds eager to see the gun that killed Hitler? Would such crowds be motivated by genuine historical interest or by the kind of morbid curiosity that draws people to crime scenes and murder sites? Would photographs of the pistol circulate online, becoming fodder for memes, jokes, or neo-Nazi propaganda? These are not hypothetical concerns. Museums have learned through painful experience that controversial artifacts can generate reactions far beyond what curators intend or desire. When the National Museum of American History displayed the Enola Gay, the B-29 bomber that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the exhibit generated enormous controversy. Veterans groups felt the presentation was too critical of the decision to use atomic weapons. Peace activists felt it wasn't critical enough. The exhibit became a flashpoint for broader cultural wars about American power, military history, and how we remember controversial events. The museum ultimately had to revise the exhibit significantly. Hitler's pistol would present similar or greater challenges. Any display would need to carefully balance multiple considerations. It would need to educate viewers about the historical context without glorifying Hitler or making his suicide seem heroic. It would need to acknowledge the millions of victims without using the pistol to overshadow their stories. It would need to prevent the exhibit from becoming a gathering place for neo-Nazis, perhaps through security measures, visitor screening, or careful design that makes the pistol difficult to photograph for propaganda purposes. The German Historical Museum in Berlin faces these challenges constantly in presenting the Nazi era as part of German national history. German law strictly prohibits the display of Nazi symbols and memorabilia, except in educational or historical contexts, and museums must demonstrate that their presentations serve legitimate educational purposes rather than glorifying the regime. This legal framework reflects Germany's ongoing struggle with its Nazi past and its determination to prevent any resurgence of Nazi ideology through Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past. German museums take extraordinary care in how they present Nazi-era artifacts. Swastikas are typically covered or displayed only in contexts that clearly condemn Nazi ideology. Nazi uniforms are shown alongside photographs of concentration camp victims to provide moral context. Hitler's writings and speeches are presented with extensive critical commentary. The goal is to educate Germans and international visitors about what happened during the Nazi era, while making absolutely clear that these events represent a shameful period that must never be repeated. The pistol also embodies questions about the banality of evil that philosopher Hannah Arendt explored in her controversial book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Arendt covered the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who had organized the logistics of the Holocaust, arranging train schedules, coordinating deportations, managing the paperwork of genocide. Arendt expected to encounter a sadistic monster, a demon in human form. Instead, she found an ordinary, rather mediocre man who claimed he was simply doing his job, following orders, advancing his career within the system. Arendt's controversial conclusion was that great evil often results not from extraordinary wickedness, but from ordinary people committing atrocities within systems that normalize cruelty. Eichmann was not driven by hatred of Jews. He claimed he had nothing personal against them. He was driven by ambition, by desire for promotion, by the bureaucratic mindset that reduces human beings to numbers and logistics problems. Arendt's insights challenged comfortable assumptions that evil requires demons. Evil, she argued, can emerge from thoughtlessness, from failure to think critically about what one is doing, from the human tendency to follow authority and conform to organizational norms. Hitler's pistol embodies this banality in an unexpected way. The weapon itself is utterly ordinary, a mass-produced German firearm, well-crafted and functional, but with no special features. Thousands of identical Walther PPKs were manufactured and sold. There is nothing inherently evil about the metal, springs, and firing pin that make up the weapon. A Walther PPK sitting on a table is just a gun, indistinguishable from thousands of others, except perhaps by its serial number. Its significance exists entirely in what it represents and who used it. This ordinariness is both disturbing and instructive. Evil does not require special tools or supernatural elements. It requires only human choices and human actions. The pistol that ended Hitler's life was an ordinary weapon that any German citizen might have owned. The gas chambers that murdered millions at Auschwitz were built using ordinary industrial equipment and chemicals. The trains that transported Jews to death camps were ordinary passenger and freight trains. The bureaucrats who organized the Holocaust used ordinary filing systems and typewriters. This banality, the fact that genocide was carried out using mundane everyday tools and methods, is part of what makes the Holocaust so disturbing and so instructive. If Hitler's pistol were displayed in a museum, this ordinariness should be part of the educational message. The weapon should not be presented as something special or powerful in itself, but as an ordinary object that gained significance only through the evil of the man who used it. This contextualization could help viewers understand that preventing future atrocities requires not just stopping extraordinary villains, but also resisting the ordinary mechanisms through which evil operates, following unjust orders, participating in dehumanizing systems, failing to think critically about what one is doing. The market for Nazi memorabilia forces another uncomfortable reflection on human nature and the economics of evil. Why do these objects command such high prices decades after the war's end? Why are collectors willing to pay fortunes for items associated with a regime that murdered millions? The phenomenon reveals disturbing truths about human fascination with darkness and the commodification of history. Some collectors are motivated by legitimate historical interest. They view Nazi artifacts as important primary sources that help us understand a crucial period in human history. These collectors often have extensive libraries, maintain careful records, and make their collections available to researchers. Many eventually donate their items to museums or educational institutions. They see themselves as custodians, preserving history for future generations. Their motivations, while sometimes questioned, are generally accepted as legitimate within the historical community. Other collectors are driven primarily by investment considerations. Nazi memorabilia has proven to be a remarkably stable and appreciating asset class over decades. Items that sold for modest sums in the 1950s and 1960s now command prices orders of magnitude higher. A German Iron Cross that might have cost $50 in 1960 could sell for several $1,000s today. An SS uniform that was worth a few $100s might now fetch tens of thousands. Collectors who purchased Nazi artifacts decades ago have seen enormous returns on their investments, often far exceeding returns on stocks, bonds, or real estate. This financial dimension attracts investors who might have no personal interest in Nazi history but recognize a lucrative market. They treat Nazi memorabilia like any other alternative investment: art, vintage cars, rare wines. They buy, hold, and sell based on market conditions and price trends. Their participation in the market is purely transactional and financial. Whether this is morally acceptable is hotly debated. Some argue that treating Nazi artifacts as investment commodities is deeply offensive, reducing objects connected to genocide to mere assets. Others contend that investment buyers at least preserve items that might otherwise be destroyed, and that their motivations are no worse than those of art investors who have no personal appreciation for the paintings they buy and sell. Most disturbing are collectors motivated by ideological sympathy with Nazism. Neo-Nazi movements exist in many countries, despite legal prohibitions and social taboos. These extremists venerate Hitler and Nazi ideology. They seek objects associated with the Third Reich not for historical study or investment, but because they view them as sacred relics, physical connections to leaders and movements they admire. For them, owning Hitler's pistol would not be about historical preservation. It would be about possessing something Hitler touched, something connected to the Führer they worship. The thought that Hitler's pistol might end up in neo-Nazi hands is deeply troubling to historians, Jewish groups, and anyone concerned about the resurgence of fascist ideologies. This concern has motivated some of the strongest opposition to selling Hitler artifacts. Even if such sales are legal, critics argue, they should not occur because of the risk that buyers might be extremists. The counter-argument is that prohibiting sales drives the market underground, where items circulate through black markets with no oversight, making it even more likely they'll end up with extremists. Some countries have attempted to address these concerns through legislation restricting the sale and display of Nazi artifacts. Germany's laws are particularly strict. Section 86A of the German Criminal Code prohibits the public display of Nazi symbols, including swastikas, SS runes, and other emblems, except for educational, artistic, or historical purposes. Violations can result in fines or imprisonment up to 3 years. Museums and educational institutions can display such items, but they must demonstrate that the presentation serves legitimate educational purposes and includes appropriate contextualization condemning Nazi ideology. Austria has similar laws reflecting its own complicated history with Nazism. France prohibits the sale of certain Nazi items, though enforcement is inconsistent. Israel restricts the import of Nazi memorabilia, except for educational or research purposes, and items must be properly documented and approved by authorities. But in countries with more permissive laws, including the United States and United Kingdom, the trade continues largely unregulated. Online auction sites periodically face controversies over Nazi items being sold on their platforms, leading to policy changes that ban some categories while allowing others. eBay, for example, prohibits the sale of items that bear Nazi symbols unless they are coins, stamps, or certain historical items, where the symbol is integral and the item is not being marketed to neo-Nazis. Amazon has faced similar controversies and has inconsistently enforced policies about Nazi memorabilia. These corporate policy decisions reflect the difficulty of balancing free commerce against ethical concerns, legal restrictions in different countries, and public relations considerations. The ethical dilemma extends beyond the commercial market to fundamental questions about what should be done with Hitler's pistol if it were found and authenticated. Several options exist, each with arguments for and against. Option 1, destroy it. Destroying the pistol would eliminate any risk of it becoming a shrine for extremists or a commodity for profiteers. It would make a strong statement that we do not preserve objects that might glorify evil. However, destruction would also eliminate an important historical artifact that could help us understand Hitler's final moments. It would deprive future generations of physical evidence related to a crucial historical event, and practically, destruction would be irreversible. If we later decided the pistol should have been preserved, it would be too late. Option 2. Keep it hidden in archives. Placing the pistol in a government or museum archive, never displayed but preserved and available to qualified researchers, would balance preservation against public access concerns. This is what many governments do with sensitive historical materials. However, permanent non-display raises questions about public rights to access historical evidence. It also doesn't completely eliminate risk. Archives can be broken into, items can be stolen, corrupt officials might be bribed to provide access to extremists. Option 3. Display it in a museum. Public display would maximize educational value and allow people to engage directly with this significant historical artifact. Museums have extensive experience contextualizing difficult objects. However, display creates all the risks discussed earlier, the pistol becoming a morbid attraction, being photographed for propaganda purposes, drawing neo-Nazi visitors. It also raises questions about which museum should display it and under what circumstances. Option 4. Keep it in private hands. Allowing the pistol to remain privately owned wherever it might currently be has the advantage of not requiring difficult decisions about destruction or display. Some argue that private ownership might be safest. The owner can keep it secure without the publicity that government or museum possession would generate. However, private ownership means no public benefit, no educational use, and no guarantee about what will happen to the pistol in the future when the current owner dies or sells it. There is no consensus among historians, ethicists, or the public about which option is best. The disagreement reflects deeper uncertainties about how societies should remember evil, what we owe to history, and what we owe to future generations. These questions persist regardless of whether Hitler's pistol is ever found. They apply equally to other controversial artifacts: Göring's medals, Himmler's personal effects, documents signed by Nazi leaders. Each item presents similar ethical dilemmas. The story of Hitler's missing death pistol is ultimately a story about the nature of historical truth itself and the limits of what we can know about even recent, well-documented events. It demonstrates how difficult establishing definitive facts can be when evidence is destroyed, witnesses die or lie, and powerful interests shape narratives for political purposes. The final hours in the Führer bunker were witnessed by dozens of people. Photographs were taken. Soviet forensic teams conducted investigations, yet fundamental questions remain unresolved decades later. If we cannot establish with absolute certainty what happened to a pistol in 1945, a time when modern documentation existed, when witnesses survived, when physical evidence was collected, what hope do we have of establishing truth about more distant historical events? What can be said with confidence? Hitler died on April 30th, 1945, in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, as Soviet forces fought through the city above him. The manner of his death involved either gunshot, cyanide poisoning, or both. The evidence suggests he probably did both, biting a cyanide capsule and shooting himself nearly simultaneously to ensure death. A Walther PPK pistol was present at the scene and was likely the weapon used. His body was carried to the Chancellery Garden and partially burned. Soviet forces discovered the remains 2 days later, conducted an autopsy, identified Hitler through dental records, and eventually destroyed the remains completely in 1970. Beyond these basic facts, certainty dissolves into probability, speculation, and competing narratives. We cannot say definitively whether the gunshot or the cyanide killed Hitler, or whether he was already dying from cyanide when he pulled the trigger. We cannot identify which specific Walther PPK was used from among the several similar weapons in the bunker. We cannot trace the pistol's location after April 30th, 1945, because no reliable chain of custody exists. We cannot determine whether it is currently in Russian archives, in a private collection, or was destroyed decades ago. The world was stunned when Hitler's death pistol vanished, not because the gun itself possessed magical properties or unique importance, but because its disappearance symbolized larger failures and uncertainties. It represented the chaos of war's end, when normal rules of evidence and documentation collapse under the weight of violence and confusion. It embodied the uncomfortable truth that evil leaders often escape the full accountability they deserve. Hitler avoided trial by choosing death on his own terms rather than facing justice at Nuremberg. The missing pistol became a metaphor for all the questions about World War II and the Holocaust that can never be fully answered, all the evidence that was destroyed, all the witnesses who died before telling their stories, all the documentation that was lost or deliberately hidden. For more than 7 decades, the pistol has existed in a strange historical limbo, simultaneously absent and present, vanished from sight, but persistent in memory and speculation. Every few years, someone claims to have found it. Auction houses announce its pending sale. Museums investigate new leads. Forensic teams examine weapons that might be authentic. Each time, the claim generates headlines, intense debates among historians, and ultimately skepticism when the evidence fails to convince experts. Perhaps someday the pistol will be authenticated through advances in forensic science or the opening of still classified archives. Perhaps it was destroyed decades ago, and the question will remain forever unresolved. Perhaps it sits forgotten in someone's attic or a government warehouse, its significance unknown to those who possess it. The lesson of the missing pistol extends far beyond Hitler and World War II. It speaks to the broader human challenge of preserving truth and memory in the face of time, politics, and intentional obfuscation. Every generation must grapple with how to remember its darkest chapters, how to preserve evidence without glorifying evil, how to balance the importance of historical artifacts against the moral dangers they might pose. The pistol's absence forces each new generation to confront these questions anew, without the false certainty that a physical object might provide. What the missing pistol reveals most clearly is that history is not a settled, finished project, but an ongoing investigation, constantly revised as new evidence emerges and new questions are asked. The gaps in the historical record, the missing documents, the unanswered questions, the vanished objects, are as instructive as the evidence we do possess. They teach humility about how much we can know, and honesty about how much remains uncertain. They challenge simplistic narratives and force more nuanced understanding. They remind us that convenient closure is often illusory, and that living with uncertainty is part of engaging honestly with the past. In the end, the most important truths about Hitler and the Third Reich do not depend on the location of a single pistol. The historical record is overwhelmingly clear about Hitler's crimes, even if details of his final moments remain debatable. 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in the Holocaust. World War II killed more than 70 million people worldwide. Hitler's ideology of racial supremacy, territorial conquest, and genocidal violence produced unprecedented suffering across Europe and beyond. These facts are established by mountains of evidence, documents meticulously kept by Nazi bureaucrats, photographs and films, survivor testimonies, physical remains of death camps, mass graves, the demographic record of populations destroyed. The missing pistol changes none of this, but the gun's disappearance does remind us that history is complex, that simple questions sometimes lack simple answers, and that the past never releases its grip on the present entirely. Hitler died in 1945, but the shadows he cast continue to affect our world. Those shadows include unanswered questions, persistent mysteries, and ongoing debates about how to remember and learn from humanity's darkest chapter. The missing pistol is one small piece of this larger puzzle, a question mark that refuses to be erased. Perhaps there is something fitting about the fact that the weapon which ended Hitler's life cannot be definitively located. Hitler spent his final years trying to control everything: the course of the war, the fate of nations, the lives and deaths of millions. He micromanaged military operations, often disastrously. He ordered the murder of entire populations. He demanded absolute loyalty and obedience from everyone around him. In the end, he could control the manner of his death, choosing suicide over capture. But he could not control what would happen after, how his death would be investigated, how his remains would be treated, what would become of his personal effects, how history would remember him. The pistol's vanishing is a final, fitting loss of control. The man who tried to dominate history could not prevent the weapon that ended his life from disappearing into historical uncertainty. This seems appropriate, even poetic. Hitler sought to create a 1,000-year Reich and a new order in Europe. He achieved 12 years of tyranny that ended in his suicide in a bunker. He wanted to be remembered as a great leader and visionary. He is remembered as history's greatest monster. He wanted control over his death and his legacy. He got control over his death but lost control over everything else. What remains Decades after that April afternoon in 1945, when Hitler put a pistol to his temple or in his mouth and pulled the trigger, is not the weapon itself, but the lessons of the era it represents. Those lessons persist, regardless of whether the gun is in Moscow or Maryland or at the bottom of a river. They persist in the Holocaust memorials that mark the sites of murder. They persist in the education of new generations about the dangers of totalitarianism, racism, and hatred. They persist in the commitment, however imperfectly realized, to prevent such atrocities from recurring. They persist in the international laws against genocide that were created in response to the Holocaust. They persist in the determination that we must remember, even when remembering is painful, even when the evidence is incomplete, even when questions remain unanswered. The pistol's absence, far from erasing these lessons, perhaps makes them more powerful. Without a physical object to become fixated on, attention must shift to ideas, values, and moral responsibilities, the truly important elements of historical memory. Hitler's death ended his life, but not his relevance to our understanding of human nature, political systems, and moral choice. The questions raised by his regime: how does evil gain power? Why do ordinary people participate in atrocities? How can genocide be prevented? What are we willing to do to defend human dignity and rights? Remain as urgent now as they were in 1945. The pistol vanished into the chaos of a collapsing city, into the fog of war, into the contradictions of witness testimony, and the secrecy of Soviet archives. Perhaps it will someday be found. Perhaps the mystery will be solved. Perhaps we will learn that it was destroyed in 1945, or lost in a Soviet warehouse, or stolen by a looter who never realized what he had, or perhaps the mystery will remain forever unsolved, a permanent question mark in the historical record. Either way, the moral imperative to remember, to understand, and to learn from the Holocaust and World War II remains as urgent as ever. The missing pistol cannot diminish that imperative. If anything, the mystery surrounding the weapon reminds us that history is not simple, that easy answers are often wrong, and that engaging honestly with the past requires accepting uncertainty while maintaining moral clarity. We may not know where Hitler's pistol is, but we know what Hitler did, and we know that preventing future Hitlers requires constant vigilance, moral courage, and commitment to human dignity. The world was stunned when Hitler's death pistol vanished because people wanted certainty, closure, physical proof that the nightmare had ended. But history rarely provides such tidy conclusions. Instead, it gives us fragments, contradictions, and persistent questions. The missing pistol is one such question. Unresolved, perhaps unresolvable, but still instructive. It teaches us that even about recent history, even about well-documented events, even about matters of immense importance, we cannot always know everything we want to know. And yet we must continue trying to understand, to learn, to remember, even in the face of uncertainty. That is the challenge and the responsibility that history places on every generation. The missing pistol will not let us forget that responsibility, and perhaps that is its most important legacy.